Shut up, cowboy. You're freezing. Tonight you sleep among us, the Apache sisters. The cold was biting. Jacob Harlow had been traveling for hours, maybe days, across the rugged mountains of the southwest. The snow had fallen unexpectedly, covering the jagged rocks and narrow trails in a thick white blanket. His horse, tired and shivering, stumbled on the icy ground, forcing Jacob to hold on tightly. He had thought he knew the terrain well, but the winter had turned the familiar paths into a confusing maze. Every sound, the cracking of ice underfoot, the howl of the wind through the canyon, felt sharper in the empty, frozen wilderness. Jacob pulled his coat tight around his shoulders, wishing he had packed more supplies. But he had been confident when he left. Now, he was not so sure. He rode slowly, feeling the cold seep into his bones. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, and his face felt like it was burning from the icy wind. The sun had long disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the mountains in a deep, silent darkness. He could barely see the path, and he had already lost his sense of direction. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Breath. Jacob knew he needed shelter soon, or the cold could claim him. He had heard stories of men who froze to death, lying alone in the snow, lost and helpless. The thought made him shiver uncontrollably. Then, in the distance, he saw a thin line of smoke curling up into the dark sky. His heart leapt. Smoke meant fire. Breath. Fire meant warmth, food, possibly shelter. But it also meant people. And he did not know who those people were. In these mountains, strangers were dangerous. He had heard of Apache raids, of travelers disappearing into the night, and of small groups of settlers or hunters who were not welcoming to outsiders. Jacob's instincts told him to stay hidden, to turn back and find another path, but the cold gnawed at his resolve. His body trembled. He could feel the frost creeping into his legs, making them stiff and painful. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. His mind, sharp and careful, decided that he had no choice. Breaths. He would approach, but cautiously. He dismounted from his horse, letting it rest for a moment while he adjusted the reins. His boots crunched in the fresh snow as he moved slowly toward the smoke. The closer he got, the more he could see flickering light dancing against the shadows of the trees. And then, through the dim glow, he saw them. 3 women sitting near a fire, their faces serious but calm. They were wrapped in blankets and furs, their hands close to the flames. Their eyes, sharp and watchful, turned toward him immediately. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jacob froze in place, unsure whether to speak, move, or run. The women watched him silently. There was a quiet authority in the way they held themselves. He noticed that they were not afraid. They did not reach for weapons, but their gaze was strong, measuring him, judging him. He realized that these were not ordinary travelers. These were women who had survived in these mountains for years, maybe decades, learning every secret the wilderness could offer. They were alert, aware of every sound, every movement, every possible threat. Jacob felt a mix of fear and awe. He had traveled many miles, seen many towns, and faced danger before, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He took a cautious step forward, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. His voice, when he spoke, was rough from cold and exhaustion. I'm lost, he said, his teeth chattering. I've been traveling through these mountains, and I can't find my way. I need shelter for the night. He paused, hoping they would understand. They could see the tension in their faces, the way they leaned slightly toward each other, whispering in low tones. They were deciding whether he was friend or foe, whether he was telling the truth or trying to trick them. The eldest of the three, a woman with sharp eyes and dark hair that fell over her shoulders, finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firm. "Why are you here, stranger?" "These mountains are not kind to those who wander carelessly." Jacob swallowed hard. He felt the weight of her gaze, the authority in her tone. He did not try to lie. He could not. Desk. I made a wrong turn, he said honestly. The snow. It came so fast, and I got lost. I have food and supplies, but I don't know how to survive the night out there. But the woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his face. Then, to his surprise, she nodded slowly.
"You speak truth," she said, "and the night is cold."
Come closer. Sit by the fire. Ration. Tonight, you sleep among us. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. But Jacob felt a rush of relief, mixed with disbelief. He had expected suspicion, maybe even hostility, but not this. This offer of help from strangers in the wild.
He moved closer to the fire, careful not to show too much weakness, but unable to hide his exhaustion.
The sisters shifted slightly, making room for him. The warmth of the flames hit his face like a blessing. He sank to the ground, trying not to collapse completely, and let the heat seep into his frozen body. He felt a deep gratitude he could not fully express. The eldest sister, whose name he learned was Ahioka, handed him a small piece of dried meat and some water. He ate quickly, savoring every bite, knowing that his body had needed this more than he realized. As he warmed by the fire, he could observe them more closely. They were not just surviving, they were thriving in their own way. Their movements were careful and deliberate, showing skill and experience. The way they tended the fire, arranged the blankets, and watched the shadows told Jacob that they had spent years learning to live with the land, to respect its dangers, and to protect themselves from intruders. He realized that these women had stories that went far beyond what he could imagine. Stories of struggle, of courage, of survival in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. Jacob spoke little, afraid that too many words might betray his ignorance or his fear. Instead, he listened. He listened to the crackle of the fire, to the wind sweeping through the trees, to the subtle sounds of the night. He felt the presence of the sisters, their silent observation, their careful assessment of his character. In that quiet moment, he began to understand something important. Survival was not just about food and warmth. It was about respect, trust, and understanding. He had been wandering alone, confident in his skills as a cowboy, but here he realized that alone was not always strong. Sometimes survival meant humility, meant accepting help, meant recognizing the strength in others. Hours passed slowly. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a silent, cold blanket. Breaking. Jacob felt exhaustion pulling him into sleep, but he stayed alert, aware that he was in a place where trust was earned, not given. The sisters spoke in low tones, their conversation flowing like a river. Words he could not fully understand, but whose tone was clear, calm, deliberate, careful. Rest. They were deciding whether he belonged here for more than a single night, whether he had the character to earn their respect. Jacob did not mind. He knew that respect was not something to demand. It was something to show, through action and honesty. Finally, as the night deepened, the eldest sister, Ahioka, gestured to a blanket. "Cover yourself," she said. "The fire will not last forever, and the night is long." Jacob took the blanket with gratitude, wrapping it around his shoulders and feeling its warmth against his chilled body. He settled closer to the fire, letting the heat flow into him. And for the first time in hours, he felt a sense of safety. The fear had not disappeared, it never would, but it had been tempered by the quiet kindness of these strangers, by the strength of these women who had taken him in without hesitation. Jacob realized, as he drifted toward a restless sleep, that this night would stay with him forever. He was a cowboy, used to traveling alone, to facing danger with skill and courage. But here, among the Apache sisters, he had learned something new, that even in the coldest, harshest wilderness, humanity could survive. Breath, not through brute strength alone, but through courage, wisdom, and a willingness to extend trust even when it was risky. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the presence of the sisters carry him into sleep, knowing that he had found a rare and precious moment of safety in a world that often offered none. The snow fell silently outside, covering the mountains in white breath. The wind howled through the canyons, but inside the small circle of fire there was warmth, there was care, there was survival. And Jacob, the lost cowboy, understood that he was not alone, not tonight, not while these sisters watched over him, not while their quiet strength held the cold at bay. The night was deep and silent, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the thin walls of their shelter. Jacob Harlow sat close to the warmth, feeling the frozen stiffness in his limbs slowly ease. His fingers, once numb, were beginning to regain their feeling, and his lungs no longer burned with the cold. He looked at the three sisters, Lilu, Nayeli, and Ahioka, sitting quietly around the fire, past. Their eyes followed him carefully, measuring his every movement, but there was no anger in their gaze, only curiosity and caution. Jacob realized he had entered a world very different from the one he had known. In towns, people looked at strangers with suspicion. Yes, but they relied on guards, sheriffs, and walls to protect themselves. Here, in the middle of the mountains, protection came from skill, knowledge, and courage. These women had survived where others might have perished. Their very presence demanded respect. Jacob wanted to show that he understood that. But he was careful not to speak too much. Ahioka, the eldest, finally broke the silence. "You have traveled far," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The snow is not kind to men who wander alone. Why do you risk the mountains?" Jacob hesitated. He had been a man used to freedom, to riding across wide-open lands without thinking too deeply about the dangers. But now, facing these women, he felt the weight of his recklessness. "I thought I knew the trails," he admitted honestly. "I underestimated the snow. I did not know it would come so fast, so heavy. I got lost." His voice cracked slightly, but he did not lie. He knew that lying here in front of these women would not help him. They would see through it immediately. Lilu, the youngest sister, tilted her head. "And yet you came toward the fire," she said softly. "You could have stayed hidden, watched from the shadows, waited for help that might never come. Why did you choose to risk approaching us?" Jacob considered her question carefully.
"Because I had no choice," he said, "and because I hoped you would help."
"I would have stayed hidden, yes, but I knew that alone I would not survive the night."
The sisters exchanged glances.
Jacob could see that they were thinking, weighing his words, trying to understand not only what he said, but what kind of man he was. Finally, Ahioka spoke again. "The night is cold, but words are not enough to keep you safe. Actions matter." She motioned toward the fire. "Sit closer. Eat. Warm yourself. And tomorrow we will see what kind of man you are." Jacob obeyed, though he felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. He was grateful for the food and warmth, yes, but he was also aware that he was being tested, observed. The sisters were not simply offering kindness, they were measuring him. They were deciding whether he belonged here, even for a single night, or whether he was someone they needed to drive away before trouble came. As he ate the dried meat and drank the water they offered, Jacob's thoughts drifted. He remembered the long days on horseback, the endless miles across the plains, and the moments when he had felt truly alive, riding under the sun with the wind in his face. But he also remembered the dangers, the storms, the wild animals, the fights with other men over land, cattle, or pride.
He realized now that survival was more than riding fast or shooting straight.
It was about judgment, awareness, and respect for forces larger than oneself. And these women had it in abundance. The sisters began to talk among themselves in soft whispers. Jacob could not understand their words, but he could understand the meaning behind the tone. They were discussing him, yes, but also the conditions outside, the snow, the dangers of the mountains, the world beyond their shelter. He listened carefully, sensing their deep connection to the land. These mountains were not just a place to survive. They were a world they had learned to read, to respect, and to protect. Every sound, every shadow, every shift of the wind carried information that Jacob had never considered. After a while, Ahioka gestured for him to follow her. They moved to a small clearing near the fire, where the wind had less strength. Prostrated. She handed him another blanket and motioned for him to sit. You will sleep soon, she said. But first, you must understand, Rasp. You are not here as a guest in a town where rules are written on paper. You are here in the mountains where life is earned. You must learn respect before you can find safety. Jacob nodded, understanding that this was more than a warning. It was a lesson. He felt a deep sense of humility. He had spent years believing that strength came from skill with a gun, from knowledge of cattle, from being able to ride faster and shoot straighter than other men, but here, he realized, strength was measured differently. It was measured by patience, awareness, and the ability to respect others. The night grew colder, and the fire flickered against the darkening sky. Jacob watched the sisters work together with a quiet efficiency. They checked their supplies, adjusted blankets, and kept the fire alive with a careful rhythm. There was a sense of harmony in their actions, a shared understanding that each one had a role and each role mattered. Jacob felt a pang of admiration. He had never seen people work together like this, not with weapons or orders, but with trust and skill. As the hours passed, Jacob found himself talking more. He spoke of his travels, of the small towns he had passed through, of the cattle he had driven across plains, of storms that had left him soaked and shivering. The sisters listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes nodding quietly. He realized that sharing stories was not only a way to pass the time, it was a way to build trust, to show who he was without pretending. And slowly he began to feel that the walls of suspicion were breaking, even if only slightly. Ahioka finally sat down beside him and looked directly into his eyes. "Tomorrow you will work," she said.
You will help gather wood, check the fire, and learn what it means to survive in these mountains. We will see then if your words match your actions.
The night is not just for sleep. It is for learning, for observing, for understanding the world in ways that cannot be taught by books or towns.
Jacob nodded, feeling both nervous and excited.
He had spent his life moving quickly, solving problems as they came, but here, in this hidden corner of the mountains, he understood that patience and observation were equally important.
He felt a strange sense of respect for these women, not just for their skill and courage, but for the way they had survived with intelligence and care. By the time Jacob lay down to sleep, wrapped in blankets and warmed by the fire. He felt a sense of peace that was unusual for him. The wind howled outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside this small circle of light, he felt safe. Not because of walls or locks, but because of trust. Fragile, earned, and carefully given. He knew he would never forget this night nor the lesson it had already begun to teach him. As he drifted into a light, cautious sleep, he thought of the paths that had brought him here. He thought of the mistakes that had left him lost and exposed. And he thought of the sisters, their quiet strength, and the way they had looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger, but with a careful, measured understanding. The first time in a long while he realized that survival was not only about facing danger, but also about understanding and respecting those who had faced it longer, who knew it better, and who had learned to endure it. The night stretched on. Break. Outside, the mountains were harsh and unforgiving. But inside, Jacob Harlow felt warmth, protection, and the beginnings of trust. He knew this was only the start of his journey with the sisters, that tomorrow would bring challenges and tests he could not yet imagine. But for now, he allowed himself to rest, feeling the power of their presence and the strange comfort of being accepted, even in a world so wild and cold. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the snow-covered mountains, casting a pale golden light on the icy peaks. Jacob Harlow awoke to the quiet murmur of the sisters moving about the shelter. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the cold mountain air inside. Jacob rubbed his eyes, stretched his stiff limbs, and realized how deeply he had slept. The warmth of the blankets and the fire had soothed him in a way he had not expected. For the first time in days, he felt a small measure of peace. The sisters were already awake, tending the fire and preparing for the day. Lilu moved with a light, careful grace, stacking more wood while Naeli checked the edges of the shelter for any signs of danger or intrusion. Ahioka, the eldest, watched them closely, her expression calm and steady, as if she carried the weight of responsibility for the entire mountain on her shoulders. Jacob observed them silently, marveling at their efficiency. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful, yet somehow effortless. These women had survived in a harsh land, where a single mistake could cost a life. Their strength was quiet, not loud or boastful, but it was real and undeniable. Ahioka noticed Jacob watching and motioned for him to approach. "Come closer," she said. "Eat first. You will need your strength for the work ahead." She handed him a small portion of dried meat and some water. Jacob accepted it with gratitude, feeling the warmth of the food against his cold stomach. He had not eaten a proper meal for hours, maybe even a day, and the nourishment settled into him like a balm. He took his time eating, careful not to rush, observing the sisters as they moved around him. Once he had finished, Ahioka spoke again. "Before we begin our work, you should understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. These mountains are not forgiving. Every step, every decision matters. Survival is not about strength alone. It is about wisdom, observation, and respect. The land teaches those who listen. We have learned from it. You must learn as well if you are to stay here even for a short time. Breaths gang. Jacob nodded. He felt the weight of her words. He had grown up believing that skill with a gun and speed on horseback were enough to face any danger. But here, in the mountains, he could see that these qualities were only part of the equation. Patience, awareness, and respect for the land, and for the people who knew it, were just as important. He realized that he had much to learn if he was to survive even a single day in this harsh environment.
Ahioka led him to the edge of the shelter, where a small clearing opened to the snow-covered landscape. "Today, you will help with chores," she said. "Gather wood, maintain the fire, and carry water from the stream. Simple tasks, but essential.
Survival depends on them." Jacob agreed, understanding that these tasks were not mere labor. They were lessons in observing the world, in paying attention to details, in respecting the land and the women who had made it their home. As he began gathering wood, Jacob noticed how carefully the sisters moved. They selected branches that were dry but not brittle, avoiding the ones that might break or create dangerous sparks. Rasp. They worked quietly, communicating with gestures and soft words, a rhythm that spoke of years of shared experience. Jacob tried to mirror their movements, learning by watching, imitating the care and precision they showed. Breathless. Every log he carried felt heavier than he expected, but he forced himself to persist. Each effort was a step toward earning their trust, a small way to show that he respected the rules of this world. While he worked, Ahioka told him stories. She spoke of the mountains, of the land, and of the people who had come before them. She spoke of the dangers of winter storms, of hidden cliffs, and of the animals that roamed the snowy wilderness. But she also spoke of beauty, the way the sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and pink, the quiet music of the wind through the trees, and the resilience of those who had learned to live in harmony with the mountains. Jacob listened, absorbing every word. He realized that these stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons, teaching him how to read the world, how to anticipate danger, and how to find safety.
As the morning passed, Jacob began to feel a connection forming, not just with the sisters, but with the land itself.
Brace. He learned to notice subtle signs, the way the snow shifted under his boots, the sound of a branch cracking in the distance, the movement of birds in the trees. Each detail was important, each observation a step toward understanding the mountains. He realized that survival here was not about brute strength, but about attention, awareness, and respect. During a brief pause, Jacob asked about the sisters' lives. Lilu and Nayeli shared small stories, tales of their childhood, of learning to hunt and gather, of the moments when the mountains had tested them and taught them lessons. Jacob listened with fascination. Breaths. He had traveled across many towns and plains, but he had never met people who lived so closely with nature, who relied on it for every necessity, and who had learned to respect its power. The sisters' lives were filled with hardship, yes, but also with wisdom, resilience, and a sense of harmony that Jacob found deeply moving. By midday, Jacob had begun to feel a sense of belonging, though he was still careful not to assume too much. The sisters allowed him into their world slowly, observing his actions and words, measuring his respect and sincerity. He realized that trust here was earned, not given freely, and that every action carried meaning. Each task he completed, each careful movement he made, was a way to show that he was worthy of their acceptance. Breaths. As the day went on, the sisters showed Jacob how to maintain the fire for long hours, using dry wood and careful stacking to ensure that the warmth lasted through the night. They taught him how to carry water from the stream without spilling, and how to gather wood without disturbing the delicate balance of the forest. Jacob paid close attention, realizing that even simple tasks had hidden lessons. The mountains were a teacher, and the sisters were guides, helping him to understand the world in ways he had never considered. During a brief rest, Jacob watched the sisters move with a quiet confidence. Their actions were deliberate, precise, and efficient. They worked together seamlessly, communicating with gestures, glances, and subtle movements. Jacob admired their skill, their courage, and their intelligence. He realized that these women had not only survived, but had thrived in an environment that would have broken many men. Their strength was not in numbers or weapons, but in knowledge, observation, and unity. As evening approached, the sisters invited Jacob to sit by the fire again. Breaths. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting their sharp features and calm expressions. Ahioka spoke softly, recounting more stories of survival, times when the mountains had tested them, when storms had threatened, when they had relied on each other to endure. Jacob listened intently, understanding that these were not just tales of hardship, but lessons in courage, patience, and trust. By nightfall, Jacob felt a sense of transformation. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped him when he first arrived had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet respect and deep admiration for the sisters and the land they called home. He realized that he had learned more in a single day than he had in years of traveling alone. He had seen strength in a new form, not in guns or speed, but in knowledge, observation, and resilience.
As they prepared for the night, Ayoka handed him a blanket and spoke quietly. "You have done well today," she said.
Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but remember this. Strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you can learn, observe, and respect. The mountains will continue to teach you if you are willing to listen. Jacob wrapped the blanket around himself, feeling the warmth and security it provided. He watched the sisters as they moved about, tending the fire and securing the shelter for the night. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and awe. These women had taken him in, guided him, and taught him lessons that would stay with him forever. For the first time, he understood that survival was not just about enduring danger. It was about learning, growing, and respecting the world around you. As he drifted into sleep that night, Jacob Harlow felt a quiet pride in himself, but also a deep humility. He had traveled across the plains and faced many dangers, but nothing had prepared him for the lessons of the mountains or the strength of the Apache sisters. He knew that he would never forget this day, nor the knowledge, courage, and kindness he had witnessed. The fire crackled softly, the snow continued to fall outside, and inside the small circle of warmth, Jacob felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. The morning air was sharp and cold as Jacob Harlow awoke. The mountains were painted in shades of silver and white, the snow sparkling under the early light. His muscles ached from the work of the previous day, but he felt stronger now, not just in body, but in mind. The lessons he had learned from the Apache sisters, the importance of patience, observation, and respect, had begun to take root. Today, Ayoka had promised would be a test, a chance to show that he was more than a weary traveler who stumbled upon their shelter. As he stepped outside, the sisters were already preparing for the day. Lilu gathered bundles of dry wood, Nayeli checked the edge of the small clearing for any signs of danger, and Ayoka stood tall, surveying the snow-covered mountains with a steady gaze.
Jacob noticed how seamlessly they worked together.
Each sister had a role, each action precise and meaningful. It was a harmony born of experience, trust, and necessity. Jacob knew that he would have to match their careful rhythm if he hoped to earn their respect. Ayoka approached him, her eyes calm but sharp.
"Today you will help with more than simple chores," she said. "You will learn to read the mountains as we do."
But every step you take must be thoughtful. You must observe, anticipate, and act with care. The land will tell you what you need to know if you are willing to listen. Jacob nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Beast. He understood that this was not merely physical work. It was a test of character, judgment, and respect for the sisters' way of life. Their first task was to gather firewood from deeper in the forest. The snow was heavier here, covering the ground in a thick, unbroken blanket. Jacob's boots sank with each step, making the work exhausting. Lilu moved beside him, silent but attentive, showing him how to choose branches that were dry and strong enough to burn well without sparking dangerously. Nayeli followed, demonstrating the proper way to carry the bundles without breaking them or losing balance on the uneven, icy terrain. Jacob struggled at first, but he learned quickly, realizing that each movement mattered. One wrong step could mean a broken branch, a twisted ankle, or a dangerous spark that might set the surrounding forest ablaze. While they worked, Ayoka watched from a distance, studying Jacob's actions. She had already observed his honesty, patience, and willingness to learn, but today would reveal if he could handle responsibility under pressure. Jacob felt the weight of her gaze, knowing that every choice he made mattered. He felt his muscles burn, the cold biting through his clothes and the snow sticking to his hair and beard. But he pressed on, determined not to falter, understanding that this was more than work. It was a demonstration of respect for the sisters in the mountains. After several hours, the sisters decided to take a break near the small stream that ran through the forest. The water had not frozen completely, and its clear flow provided an opportunity to refill their supplies. As Jacob knelt to scoop water into a container, he noticed movement near the tree line, a small group of settlers, their horses visible in the distance. They were not immediately threatening, but their presence carried a sense of tension. The sisters noticed as well, their eyes narrowing as they exchanged quick, silent glances.
Hyoka approached Jacob quietly. "Do not speak unless necessary," she whispered.
Observe first. They may be dangerous, or they may seek information. How you respond will reveal your character.
Jacob's heart raced. He had encountered settlers before, men who were often suspicious of outsiders and hostile toward Apache communities. He knew that a single wrong word or gesture could provoke conflict.
He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him.
The settlers dismounted and began moving toward the stream.
Jacob noticed the subtle signs the sisters had taught him, the way the wind carried sound, the footprints in the snow, the way branches shifted under small movements. He understood that observation was as important as action. Ahioka spoke softly again. Decide carefully. You may speak, hide, or act, but know that each choice has consequences. Show us that you are wise enough to survive here. Jacob took a deep breath and considered the options. He could retreat, hide behind the trees, and avoid contact. That would be the safest choice, but it would also reveal fear and hesitation. He could confront the settlers with words, risking conflict, but also potentially earning their respect. Or he could find a clever way to divert attention, using observation and insight rather than brute force. His mind raced as he weighed each possibility, recalling everything he had learned from the sisters in the mountains. Inspiration. Finally, Jacob acted. He moved slightly to the side, staying partially hidden behind a snow-covered rock, and called out in a calm voice, "Greetings!
"We mean no harm. We are only here to gather water."
The settlers paused, startled by the unexpected voice. Jacob continued, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "The mountains are dangerous. The snow is deep.
You would be wise to turn back before it worsens." He gestured subtly toward the tree line, careful not to provoke fear or anger.
The settlers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves.
After a tense moment, they nodded and retreated slowly, keeping a cautious distance.
Brask. Jacob felt a rush of relief, mixed with pride. He had faced a potential threat without violence, using observation, patience, and careful judgment. When he returned to the sisters, he saw Ahyoka's eyes were calm but approving. She nodded slightly, acknowledging that he had acted wisely under pressure. The rest of the day was filled with more challenges. Jacob learned to navigate steep inclines covered in ice, to identify safe paths for their horses, and to carry heavier loads of wood without losing balance.
Each task tested his endurance, patience, and awareness.
Breaths. The sisters guided him, correcting mistakes with gentle firmness, showing him that survival in these mountains required not only physical strength but also careful thought and respect for the environment.
During a brief rest, Jacob asked about the sisters' past, wanting to understand how they had become so skilled.
Ahioka spoke of the hardships they had endured, the loss of their parents, the constant need to protect themselves from hostile outsiders, and the many winters they had survived in these mountains. She spoke with a quiet pride, emphasizing lessons learned rather than dwelling on suffering. Jacob listened, realizing that their strength came not only from skill but from resilience, courage, and a deep connection to each other and the land.
By late afternoon, the group returned to the shelter with their gathered wood and supplies.
Jacob was exhausted, his muscles sore, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had survived the challenges of the day, observed the mountains, and demonstrated his respect and capability. The sisters allowed him a brief moment of rest before tending to the fire and preparing for the evening. Jacob felt a growing bond with them, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. He was no longer just a lost traveler. He was a participant in their world, learning its rules and earning their trust. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ahioka spoke to Jacob. "Today you have shown courage and wisdom. You have observed carefully, acted thoughtfully, and respected the mountains and our ways. This is not the end of your test, but it is an important step. Remember that survival is not about the strongest or the fastest. It is about the mind, the heart, and the choices you make." Jacob nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He realized that his journey was changing him, shaping him into a person who understood more than just riding horses or shooting straight. He was learning to read the land, to respect others, and to act with patience and care. The mountains were teaching him lessons he could never have learned in a town or on a plain. That night, as Jacob lay by the fire wrapped in blankets, he reflected on the day's events. The encounter with the settlers had been a real test, a moment when his choices mattered not just for himself but for the sisters and their home. He understood now that every action carried weight, and that true strength came from wisdom, awareness, and respect. The sisters' guidance had transformed his understanding of survival, showing him that courage alone was not enough. The wind howled outside, and the snow fell silently, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside the shelter, Jacob felt warmth, safety, and the quiet approval of the Apache sisters. He closed his eyes, letting the lessons of the day sink in, feeling both pride and humility. Rasp. He had faced danger, demonstrated judgment, and survived with their guidance. And he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new lessons, but he also knew that he was no longer the same man who had stumbled into their fire the first night. As sleep overtook him, Jacob felt a deep sense of gratitude. The sisters had not only offered him warmth and food, but had taught him the most important lesson of all, that survival depended on more than strength or skill. It depended on respect, observation, patience, and courage, the kind of courage that came from understanding the world and one's place within it. And for the first time, Jacob felt that he truly belonged, even if only temporarily, among the Apache sisters who had chosen to share their strength and knowledge with him. The morning sun crept slowly over the snow-covered mountains, spilling light across the frozen landscape. Jacob Harlow awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation. Today was different. The night had been peaceful, filled with warmth from the fire and the blankets the sisters had provided, but he knew that his time in this hidden world was coming to an end. The mountains felt alive around him, the wind moving through the trees, the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots, and the distant murmur of a small stream. Each sound was a reminder of the lessons he had learned here, and of the strength and courage of the Apache sisters. Ahioka, Lilu, and Nayeli were already awake, tending to the fire and preparing their small shelter for the day. Their movements were calm and practiced, each gesture precise and meaningful. Jacob watched quietly, feeling a deep admiration for the way they lived. They moved with purpose, guided by knowledge earned through years of survival in this harsh, unforgiving land. He realized that he had learned more in a few days with them than he had in years traveling alone. Their strength was not just in their skill or courage, but in their unity, wisdom, and understanding of the mountains they called home. Ahioka approached him and placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. "Jacob," she said softly, "today you leave these mountains, but remember what you have learned. Survival is not about fear, nor is it about strength alone. It is about respect, patience, and the choices you make when the world is harsh. Carry these lessons with you, Franz." Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He understood that he was leaving more than a shelter or a fire behind. He was leaving a part of himself that had grown stronger, wiser, and more humble. The sisters handed him provisions for the journey ahead. A small bundle of food, extra blankets, and a water container filled from the clear mountain stream. They watched as he packed carefully, ensuring nothing was wasted or treated carelessly. Jacob felt a deep gratitude. They had not only given him safety and shelter, but had taught him lessons he could carry for the rest of his life. He looked at each sister in turn, Lilu with her quiet determination, Nayeli with her sharp eyes and steady hands, and Ahayoka with her calm authority. Verdas. Their eyes met his, and he saw pride and understanding reflected there. Before leaving, Jacob helped the sisters tend the fire one last time. He arranged the wood carefully, stacking it so it would burn efficiently for the next hours, leaving a small part of himself behind in the warmth of the flames. He understood that this was more than a practical gesture. It was a way of showing respect and gratitude. The sisters watched silently, nodding approvingly. Jacob felt a sense of belonging, knowing that even in his absence, his efforts would continue to support them. As he prepared to ride, the cold mountain air bit at his face, but it no longer felt threatening. He had learned to read the land, to observe carefully, and to move with purpose. Each step, each choice was deliberate. He mounted his horse, feeling the animal beneath him steady and sure. The sisters stood together, watching him leave, their presence a quiet reminder of the lessons and strength he had witnessed. Jacob paused for a moment, looking back at the small shelter tucked among the trees. The fire's smoke curled into the sky, and the snow sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and reverence. The mountains had been harsh, the journey difficult. But in those challenges, he had discovered resilience within himself he had not known existed. More importantly, he had witnessed courage and wisdom in the sisters, a form of strength that could not be measured by gun or muscle alone. As he rode slowly down the narrow trail, Jacob reflected on the events of the past days. He remembered the first night when he stumbled upon the sisters, lost and freezing, unsure if they would help or turn him away first. He remembered the careful way they had observed him, the lessons he had learned by watching their movements, listening to their words, and following their guidance. He remembered the test with the settlers when he had to choose between fear and wisdom, and how the sisters had silently judged his actions, shaping his understanding of responsibility and courage. The memory of their stories lingered in his mind, the tales of survival, of loss, of resilience in the harsh mountains. The sisters had spoken of winters that tested their strength, of times when the snow threatened to trap them for days, of the skill and patience required to gather firewood, water, and food. They had spoken not with bitterness but with calm pride, sharing wisdom that Jacob realized would guide him long after he left these mountains. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, white and bright under the midday sun. Jacob felt a mixture of freedom and sadness. Freedom because he could continue his journey into new lands. Sadness because he would be leaving a place that had reshaped his understanding of courage, respect, and survival. Proceed. Yet he carried with him a sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the world, and a quiet strength that came from having lived among people who embodied resilience and wisdom.
As he followed the winding trail, he thought of the sisters' words about patience and observation.
He realized that every action, no matter how small, carried significance. A spot. The lessons of the mountains were not only about survival in the wilderness, but about life itself. How to treat others with respect, how to act with thoughtfulness, and how to recognize strength where it is often least expected. Jacob felt gratitude for their teachings, understanding that they had given him a gift far greater than food, fire, or shelter. Hours passed and the shelter of the trees gave way to open slopes, the wind stronger and colder as Jacob rode higher. He noticed subtle signs of the land, how the snow shifted beneath his horse's hooves, how the distant rocks indicated safer paths, how the small footprints of animals could reveal hidden dangers. Each observation reminded him of the sisters' teachings, and he felt a sense of confidence he had never known when traveling alone.
He was not just moving through the mountains, he was reading them, understanding them, respecting them.
Eventually, the mountains began to thin, and Jacob glimpsed the vast plains stretching beyond.
The journey ahead would take him back to towns, to people and roads familiar yet changed in his eyes.
Realized that he would return to a world that often measured strength by physical power, by speed, by bravado. But he now understood that true strength often lay in wisdom, patience, and courage guided by respect.
Jacob thought of the sisters again, imagining them tending the fire, gathering wood, and maintaining their careful balance with the mountains.
Was peace. He felt a quiet connection, knowing that, though they were far behind him, their presence and teachings would continue to influence his choices, his actions, and his understanding of the world. Thus, he silently promised himself that he would honor their lessons, not through words alone, but through the way he lived, the decisions he made, and the respect he showed others. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jacob stopped for a moment to rest, looking back one last time at the snow-covered peaks. The mountains were silent, majestic, and eternal. He felt a sense of humility and wonder, realizing that he had been allowed a rare glimpse into a world where courage and strength were measured differently, where survival depended on wisdom as much as skill, and where trust and respect were the highest forms of power. With a deep breath, Jacob urged his horse forward, descending into the plains below. Each step carried him away from the mountains, but also carried with him the lessons of the Apache sisters. Inspiration. He felt stronger, wiser, and more aware of the world around him. The journey that had begun with fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty had transformed him, leaving him with a sense of gratitude and a new understanding of what it truly meant to survive and to live with honor and respect. The plains stretched wide and open before him, and the wind carried the faint scent of earth, grass, and distant rivers. Jacob knew he would face new challenges, new dangers, and new choices, but he also knew he was no longer the same man who had stumbled into the mountains, lost and freezing. He had been tested, guided, and transformed by the quiet strength and wisdom of three extraordinary sisters who had chosen to share their world with him, even for a short time. As night fell over the plains, Jacob set up a small camp for the evening. The fire burned brightly, the warmth surrounding him like the memory of the mountains. He reflected on the lessons he had learned, the importance of patience, the value of observation, the power of trust, and the strength that comes from respect for others and for the world. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had carried something far more valuable than provisions or warmth from the mountains. He had carried knowledge, understanding, and the quiet courage of the Apache sisters. Jacob closed his eyes, letting the firelight and the soft sounds of the plains lull him to sleep. He knew that wherever his journey led next, he would carry the lessons, the memories, and the spirit of those mountains with him forever. The world might be harsh, unpredictable, and challenging, but he had learned that courage, wisdom, and respect could guide him through even the coldest, most difficult nights. And with that understanding, Jacob Harlow slept, finally at peace, strengthened by the women who had shared their world and their wisdom with a wandering cowboy.